Let's look at the design of a contingent valuation study. The core question is, how much would you pay for this good? But there's a whole bunch of other things that you need to do. And here is one schematic of how you could set up this study. First thing is that you need to know what you're talking about. You need to do some background research. Then you need to decide on who you're going to target and how you're going to target that, sampling strategy and the population choice and those sort of things. Do you want this survey to be just for England or for the entire United Kingdom or for Europe and so on and so forth? Then you need to design your survey, and I'll talk extensively about that. Once you have designed your survey, and that is terribly important, you need to test it and change it and test it again and change it again until it does what it's supposed to do. Then you need to run your survey in the field. Data entry is important. Nowadays often goes automatic, but quality control is not automatic. You need to analyze your data. You need to run a whole range of tests to make sure that what you get is valid and what you think you're getting. Then you need to calculate consumer surplus and those sort of things. Write it up and present it and evaluate it. The key part here is the survey design, and there's a whole bunch of choices that go into that you need to carefully consider whenever you're doing a contingent valuation study or any other survey for that matter. But let's focus on CV surveys. You're interested in valuing a particular environmental good or service. So what you need to get from your respondents is their opinion on this thing. And if you're valuing something that exists but may no longer exist in the future, for instance a park that may be converted into a parking lot, you need to get people's attitudes towards people's satisfaction with the current park, what they think about parking facilities and so on and so forth, just to get some feel about what people actually value and what actually matters to them. You also need to measure their attitudes. They may just be dead against cars, or they may be very worried about air pollution and think that parks actually and the trees in the park actually help filter out air pollution. And you need to know their political leanings. Maybe they don't care about this park specifically, but they're overall pretty green, or perhaps they're pretty conservative. You need to get a feeling for all these things so as to interpret whatever answer they're going to give you. Not just about the specific good, but also in general. Then you need to describe what is currently there and what the policy intervention is about. You can never just value something. You're always trying to value a change in something. So you need to describe the current situation and the new situation, the proposed situation. If it's policy intervention, or perhaps you try to value a trend like climate change or something. And the reason that you want to value a change is, of course, because utility, essentially we're trying to measure utility, right, is not properly defined or measurable, but changes in utility are. So it's much easier to value things at a margin, much easier to value an increment than to value a total. Then you need to find a way of actually eliciting those values. That is the payment vehicle that you're using and the elicitation mechanism. I'll go back to that later. And then you need to follow up. Why did you give the answer that you gave? To get some idea of the motivation of people, including protest votes. What people see in a contingent valuation is that there's always a group of people who refuse to answer the question, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons, and you better understand it if there's good reasons. And also to have some idea of the credibility of the results that you get. And then you need to know something about the people who are answering, their age, their gender, their income, their education, their family size, and so on and so forth, anything that you think might matter. The reason for that is that even though you think you have come up with a sampling strategy that will tell you, that will give you a representative sample of the population, chances are you failed in that, and if you have some idea of the composition of the people, the composition of the sample of people who responded to your survey, then you can correct for that and scale it up to the population as a whole. But you may also be interested in, say, gender differences in answers. And what previous surveys have found is that women, for instance, tend to care more about the environment than men. And that is something that you would like to test in your results as well. So what is this whole business about the scenario? Essentially what you want to do here is make sure that everybody's on the same page as regard to the current situation. And often people don't really know what is going on. So it's good to remind them and then describe whatever change is coming, either because of policy intervention or because of some background trend. And you can use text and figures and photos and maps and video and whatever for that. Important there is that what you're describing is credible. So I earlier spoke about the big oil spill and the Exxon Valdez hit ground. The question is, of course, what can you do about that? And you can, of course, suggest in a scenario that we're going to ban the use of oil, but few people would actually believe that that is possible, even if they would argue that it's desirable. And of course, also many people who would argue that that is not desirable. So you need to come up with a credible plan. If you ask people to value something that they don't believe in, that they don't believe is feasible, then you're going to get a particularly bad answer. Then people will not like you. They will sort of start making up numbers. They will not take you seriously. They will not make the effort to give you a credible answer. So what they did in one of these studies from this particular oil spill is to suggest that from then on, all tankers should be double hulled. The Exxon Valdez had a single hull, and that is why all the oil got out and into the sea and onto the coast. What you can suggest is that from now on there will be more escort ships to make sure that the oil tanker doesn't get into trouble, and should they get into trouble, there would be more emergency response ships available. Those are credible alternatives, and it was credible in prospect at that time. Of course, these changes have happened, right? So those are things you should take care of. Another thing that is important is that the language you use is meaningful to not to your colleagues or to yourself, but to the average person you may meet on the street. So what you should not suggest in the scenario is that we're going to reduce the MPN vehicle coliform from 57 MPN per 100 milliliters to 52 MPN per 100 milliliters. Nobody knows what you're talking about when you say that. What you can do is use pictures like this. If we reduce the concentration of coliforms in this particular water, then you still can't swim there, but you can fish and you can sail on this particular lake. That is something that people understand. In the current situation, you can say, well, you can't use the fish, and I would not go near this water at all, but if we make this improvement, then you still can't swim, but at least you can fish and sail on this water. That is something that people understand. You need to be neutral in the language that you use. You can talk about little fluffy balems and the senseless slaughter of these animals, or you can talk about minor livestock losses. And the first one is, of course, nice if you're an activist and you're trying to draw attention and you're trying to win people over to your cause. But that is not what a contingent valuation study is about. A contingent valuation study is about probing people's preferences, measuring people's preferences. And what you should not try to do is influence people's preferences. That's not your job as an analyst. You need to choose the payment vehicle. How are people going to make this particular payment? And you can do it through an increase in general taxation. You can do it by adding a surcharge to a bill everybody's paying. So general taxation could be an increase in income tax or VAT. And those are different, right? Because not everybody pays income tax, and richer people pay much more income tax than poorer people. Everybody pays VAT. So that is something you can play around with. And of course, people respond very differently to this. And if you're using an increase in income taxation, then of course those people who do not pay income taxes because their income is too low, like students for instance, then those people will say, yeah, by all means go ahead, right? Increase the taxes on other people. Whereas if you say you want to pay for this by an increase in the electricity bill or in the water bill, then that's a different story, right? People will respond differently to that. You can talk about charging an entrance fee to a park, for instance, and suggest that that is the way that things are paid for, which is a different situation, right? It no longer comes from the general population, but from those people in the population who actually use that particular environmental good or service. But that may also induce a response because people associate entrance fee with fences and those sort of things. That, of course, changes the nature or potentially changes the nature of the environmental good in question. A park with a fence around is different than a park without a fence. You can also suggest that parking charges are introduced in order to visit this particular park, which of course then immediately has an effect, differential effect on those who get there by bus or by bike versus those who get there by car. All these things need to be considered, they're all options, and you just need to make a judicious choice which is the best suited for my particular purpose. You need to decide on whether or not this is a one-off payment or a recurring payment. Is it something that comes back every month or every year, or is it really just one payment? And of course that influences people's decision, and it's of course very important that people are clear about it. If you talk about an annual charge, but your respondents think it is a one-off charge, then you misinterpret the results, right? So you need to be very, very clear about that. Important thing about this, because we're typically valuing public goods, is that these payments are not voluntary, and they should not be presented as voluntary, because then people would free ride on other people's contributions. So all these things are terribly important. And then you need to worry about how you're going to ask the question. And so far I've presented this is as an open-ended question. How much are you willing to pay to preserve the whale population in the North Atlantic? You can also, and I'll show an example later, you can use a payment letter. So rather than asking the open question, how much are you willing to pay, give people a range of options and say, well, tick the box. which makes it easier for people to think about this because you provide them an anchor. It also makes it more difficult to interpret the results because plenty of research has shown that people respond to anchors. And when you present people with a range, then some people will always go for the middle regardless of the range presented, and other people will go for the top or the bottom or near the top or the bottom because that is what they like. And if you give them anchors, then people respond to those anchors. There's an open-ended question. You don't give people an anchor, which on the one hand makes it much more open. On the other hand, essentially leaves people clueless about what the appropriate scale of responses might be. You can do things in referendum format, essentially a dichotomous choice, take it or leave it. This policy will cost £10 per household per year. Do you accept that, yes or no? That's a pretty simple question that people would not have a lot of difficulty with to process. But the problem is, of course, that first you need to vary that number, right, to get information. Some people you ask about £10, some people you ask about £15, other people you ask about £5. You need to ask a lot of these questions to get to a reasonably accurate result. A variant on this is a trichotomous choice. Are you prepared to pay £10 per person per year? If somebody says yes to that question, then you can follow up with the question, are you also prepared to pay £15 per person per household per year? And that then you get a range rather than a single number. And of course, if people say no, £10 is too much, then you can follow up with, but what about £5 per household per year? I noticed that I made a mistake there. I first said per household and then I said per person. And of course, it's important to keep that in mind, that people actually answer the right question there, and that people know which question they're answering, per person or per household, and so on and so forth. The open-ended question, the big problem with that is that it's unfamiliar, right? You almost never get into the situation where you're being asked to state your valuation of something, because there's always a context available. If you're buying a pint of milk, it's not the first time you do this, right? So you have an idea of the price. If you're buying insurance or a second-hand car, that's a less familiar decision that you make, but there's plenty of information on the internet and from your friends and your family on how much something costs, right? So you have a context. But these contingent valuation studies are, of course, applied to situations that are unfamiliar. You're being asked to contribute to the preservation of a species of animal, or you're asked to contribute to the preservation of a park or a nature reserve. That is not an everyday question, and you cannot go onto the internet and look up the going price for these things. It is something that people have difficulty with. Good thing about payment letters and the dichotomous choice and so on and so forth is that it's a lot easier on people's brains to answer that question. But particularly the dichotomous choice, you need a large sample because you need to vary that X that you see here, right? You can't ask everybody the same X. You should actually ask a wide variety of X's. And if you then have heterogeneity in your sample, you have rich people and poor people, then you actually need to ask a lot of these questions before you can get an answer. So these are all things to consider in a CV design.